Hi, welcome to the third part of our ongoing series on digital boundaries for healthy living. So, how many of you gossip? There is a certain activity that we all do that we don't really think of as gossip, but I would argue that it is. Namely, we share information online that we have not performed due diligence on. Now, I've been really challenged to reflect on the ways that the warnings and proverbs about not overspeaking might apply within an online environment. And one of the conclusions I reached from studying the Hebrew wisdom literature is that we should perform due diligence on sources before we share them. In other words, before you retweet something, before you text out a URL, before you share a video, before you email somebody a podcast, you should perform due diligence. Find out if it's true. Find out, am I sharing fake information? Am I sharing something that encourages epistemic vices rather than epistemic virtues? Um, now, how do you perform due diligence on sources? How do you find this out? Um, is everything just a matter of opinion? Well, on my website, I have a list of 10 simple steps anyone can take when interrogating the veracity of a source. I also have some videos about that. I'm not going to go into all that information now because that's a whole lecture in itself. But suffice to say, there are a number of steps you can take to find out if a source is true factually, philosophically, theologically, and so forth, or, or not to find out for um, absolute certain, but to decrease the likelihood that you will be sharing something that is false. And maybe you don't have time to go through all 10 steps when evaluating a source, but could you do two or three? Could you even do one? Many of us don't. Many of us will share information without even minimal investigation into the veracity of the source that we are distributing. And putting this into practice, I suggest it's wiser to consume one web page or podcast a week critically, and that means spending some time researching the veracity of the claims. It's better to do that than to consume 10 without performing due diligence. It would be better to decrease the amount of online podcasts or web pages by 90%, but perform due diligence on the remaining 10% 100% of the time. And if that means we end up listening to less podcasts and watching less videos and reading less web pages, that might actually be a good thing. I tried to practice this in my own life, and that means that um, I don't have time to have very broad consumption of information because because I've made this commitment that everything I consume, I will spend time performing due diligence on it, or at least I try to. I'll always do one or two of the steps at information evaluation, even if I don't have time to do all 10. Um, and if you want to be very thorough, there's even like 20 or 30 different steps you can perform. Um, if you're wanting to evaluate something at the level of say academic publishing, then a even higher level of scrutiny would be necessary before you share a source. Now, when I talk to people about this, they're like, "Hey, Robin, I just wouldn't have time. I just wouldn't have time to perform due diligence on this." Okay, well, so consume less information then. Um, the the fact that we don't have time to consume information well, i.e., perform due diligence on it, should be a challenge for us to decrease the amount of information we consume. Now, when I was delivering this message to the church Sunday school, I gave a handout reflecting on how the wisdom in Proverbs might inform this question about gossip and about distributing information that we haven't performed due diligence on. And I'm not going to read the whole handout for this video, but I'm going to share it on the screen, and you can pause the video at your leisure if you want to read through the handout. So this is the first page of the handout. I'm just reflecting on some of the contrasts that Proverbs draws between the wise man and the fool. And again, you're welcome to pause the video if you want to read this in detail. And this is the second page of the handout, just warning about first impressions and the necessity of asking critical questions about the information we have been consuming. And we go on to explore what Proverbs has to say about the epistemic virtue of slowness when analyzing information, and how we can understand the warnings against sloth within an online context. Again, you're welcome to pause the video if you want to read this. And the handout continues looking at how the warnings against overspeaking and oversharing might apply within the electronic ecosystem. And for this final page in the handout, I am just going to read from it. In the large, I'll read the entire last paragraph. In Proverbs, relaying information about other people's quarrels or problems is referred to as whispering, tale-bearing, and meddling. Yet we have largely neglected serious thought about how the biblical teaching about the sin of over-speaking might transfer into the online environment. In the largely oral culture of Proverbs, the fool's sinful sharing of information manifests itself in literal sins of the mouth, babbling, murmuring, chattering, whispering, etc. In our digital culture, these same sins manifest in sins of the fingers, the retweet, the YouTube share, the forward button, or the copied URL texted in the group chat. Yet just because this type of electronic verbosity can be conducted inaudibly doesn't mean it can't be a species of the same foolish patterns associated with the fool. To pass on someone's tweet to your 300 followers after less than 10 seconds reflection may not feel similar to standing up in the marketplace to address a mob, yet the fact that our digital ecosystem enables the rapid spread of information in anonymous, semi-anonymous, unaccountable, and impersonal contexts imposes a greater responsibility on each individual, necessitating we engage in thoughtful, deliberate reflection before sharing. Indeed, the very ease with which we can share information and be insulated from the consequences of gossip, slander, false reports, etc., makes it crucial to pause long enough to reflect on the following questions. This is not the last page. What are these following questions? And I'm not going to read all these questions, but these questions invite us to self-reflect on whether the information we're sharing is merely to feed our passions or to reinforce a sense of victimhood or scandal, or whether we are actually sharing information in the way that a wise person would. And again, I encourage you to study what Proverbs has to say, because it's very, very relevant in our digital culture, even though Proverbs was written in a largely oral culture, not entirely oral, but largely an oral culture. But the principles in the wisdom literature are as relevant today as they ever were. And that leads naturally into discussion about the next boundary, which is to do with the news. I want you to do a little thought experiment. Imagine that every day you spend a little time seeking out crowds, peering into the private lives of the rich and famous, and inquiring into the things people are arguing about. For most of my life, that was me. I didn't have to go to the town square to seek out crowds, and I didn't have to sneak around at night to peep into the private lives of the rich and famous. And I didn't have to go into taverns to find out the latest things people argue about. All I had to do is turn on the news. Here is Saint Isaac the Syrian. He writes, "A humble man is never pleased to see gatherings, confused crowds, tumults, shouts and cries, opulence, adornment, and luxury, the cause of insobriety, nor does he take pleasure in conversations, assemblies, noise, and the scattering of the senses. But above all, he chooses to be by himself and to collect himself within himself, being alone in stillness. He is not engaged in manifold and fluctuating affairs, but at all times he desires to be unoccupied and free of the cares and the confusions of the things of this world, that he may keep his thoughts from going outside himself." Now, when I was writing the book, Are We All Cyborgs Now, with Joshua Pauling, I found this quote very convicting. We shared this quote in the book, and I was reflecting on how it might apply to my life. So I decided to experiment and go on a news fast. Let me just explain why this was significant for me. The first job I got from after graduating from college was as a political journalist for a lobby group. I was paid to do the modern equivalent of seeking out crowds and peering into the private lives of the rich and famous and inquiring into the things people are arguing about. And as I became more educated over the course of my life, I gradually my habits of news consumption became atypical. I gradually learned who the academics were that could help me synthesize multiple perspectives about current events, to accurately understand what people with different perspectives believe, um, scholars who could help me view current events in light of history, philosophy, literature, and neuroscience, as well as the legacy of the great books. So the news stopped being just entertainment, but a source of deep learning and reflection as I piggybacked on some of the world's wisest minds. But it left my senses scattered. And I continued to get paid to follow the news for other companies that I worked for. Um, for example, for a number of years, I was in charge of a team of bloggers for for a certain publication, and I would follow the news and then give them ideas of things to write about and um, offer perspectives and so forth. But then last February, um, that publication lost funding for their blog, and so I no longer got paid to follow the news. And then in July, when the Cyborgs book was finished and I no longer needed to follow all the tech news, um, I thought, well, I wonder what it would be like if I just took a break from the news. And I found it easier to just take a complete break than to try to modulate my consumption. And so I just did a complete blackout. I didn't even look on the news to see who won the presidential election. Although I did actually find out because somebody referred to it at work. But I find it very freeing because I can't get drawn into arguments because I don't know what people are talking about. And I could get drawn into argument because I followed um, scholars that had devoted their whole careers to understanding certain issues and would help me understand current events in light of history and the great books. I would sometimes feel like, oh yeah, I really know what's going on here and so forth. So I could get into arguments. But now when people send me political articles or something, controversial thing that's happening in the news, rather than feeling like I need to respond or give my opinion, I can just truthfully and honestly say, thank you. I don't understand what this is about because I've been in a news blackout. Now, this is an extreme solution for this season in my life, and I know that it's not for everyone, but I think we could all benefit from limiting our news consumption. And in the book that I wrote with Joshua, one of the questions we encourage people to ask is, will this news still be important? Will I still even remember this a year from now? And if not, then the news is taking time and brain space that could be spent on content that makes us wise, such as reading scripture or reading or listening to a classic novel. Our society has all sorts of technologies that make remote happenings seem especially pressing, vibrant, and relevant. In fact, more important than what is happening in our own community. We consume this information, yet without the epistemic virtue of the wise king. The fact that there has been an earthquake in Turkey or riots at our elite universities may feel more relevant than the fact that my neighbor has no way to get to work because his car is broken down. As a result, we are apt to misinterpret the danger that remote happenings actually pose to us, while insufficiently appreciating the importance for us of our responsibilities to the people God has placed in our local lives. After all, God only expects us to act responsibly in our own sphere of influence. Yet many of us, after becoming overwhelmed by the problems of the world, are tempted to turn away from our own sphere of influence to current events and politics, which has the added benefit of being cheap to us personally. After all, talking to others about the news or spreading political information is much more comfortable than helping my neighbor get to work. Now, remember I said that my habits of news consumption were atypical. Most of us consume news for entertainment or to reinforce pre-existing beliefs. It is unusual to seek out thinkers who help us synthesize multiple perspectives or to understand current events in light of the great books, or even to bring fair-mindedness to our cultural debates. Those aren't the types of news reporters and commentators um, that are popular. And this isn't surprising because both the news and cultural commentary is optimized for engagement. This is especially true for platforms like social media and YouTube that they serve us individually curated media diets based on algorithms that can personalize our information diets um, based on what um, based on what they know about you. But even standalone news sites and podcasts are still optimized for engagement in the general sense. Um, and why this is relevant is because research shows that engagement goes up when people's passions become inflamed and when there is polarization. Polarization leaves us unable to accurately summarize with fair-mindedness and charity what people with different perspectives believe. Whether we're conservative or liberal, Republican or Democrat, we tend to follow curated news networks that merely entrench us deeper into our ideology. Then when we start to think, then we start to think people who disagree with us are thoughtless, and we feel justified in dismissing contrary perspectives as fake news. Now, here are some questions you can ask about your news consumption. Does this news channel, website, program, pundit, or podcaster help me to be more reflective, more contemplative, and more thoughtful? Does this source help me to better understand why many intelligent people might disagree about this controversial issue? Is this particular source merely supporting the groupthink of one particular echo chamber? Is this source merely offering the comfort of reinforcing what I already believe? Does my information diet help me better summarize the counterarguments of those who disagree with me so that someone holding a contrary view could listen to my summary and say, yes, that's fair? Does this source help cultivate epistemic virtues or vices? Now, I've already referred to epistemic virtues before, but I haven't really defined what they are. And here are some of the epistemic virtues, which are habits of mind that are constitutive towards um, right thinking. And in this case, the type of right thinking that we need in order to flourish within the digital ecosystem. There are things like intellectual humility, tolerance for ambiguity, fair-mindedness, intellectual honesty, and so forth. The epistemic virtue of fair-mindedness is particularly important. Um, this would include being willing to listen in an even-handed way, not quick to construct straw man arguments, genuinely interested in understanding the other person's point of view, and being able and willing to represent your opponent's point of view instead of merely stereotyping, to steel man their arguments rather than straw manning them, and being able to attend to both sides of the issue um, in the way that you could credibly summarize somebody else's counter arguments. And the opposite of the epistemic virtues are the epistemic vices. And this would include things like haste, groupthink, inattention to detail, mental rigidity, and so on and so forth. And I'm not going to go through all of these, but um, it's very eye-opening when you start studying them because um, a lot, if not all, of these vices have metastasized in into the digital ecosystem. Now, on the previous list, I mentioned about wide perception gaps. Perception gaps refer to how well you can predict someone else's thoughts. So if I'm a Republican and I have a small perception gap, then I'll be able to predict what Democrats think pretty easily because I'll understand them. But if I have a large perception gap, I will not be able to accurately predict what my opponents think. For example, I might dismiss anyone who has a different political view as deluded, and I would find it difficult to summarize in my own words potential counterarguments in a way that the other person would find credible and fair. The writer C.S. Lewis is an example of someone with low perception gaps. When you read him, he is always anticipating what other people might think. And because of that, he's able to synthesize multiple perspectives and then help you think through each position and lead you to the position that he's arguing for. It's a very effective um, way of argumentation. And then when C.S. Lewis debunks a bad argument, it's persuasive and credible because you know he's taken the time to understand both positions. He was even able to understand things from the devil's point of view, as in the screw tape letters. Now, what's super fascinating about social media companies as well as YouTube is that they made very specific design and marketing choices that resulted in an increase in perception gaps, burrowing people further and further into their ideologies in ways that they cannot um, very effectively predict the viewpoints of people that they disagree with. Here is a clip that I want to just share with Aza, who was one of the people that was featured on the Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma.
They came up with a metric called perception gaps. Perception gaps are how well can someone who's a Republican estimate the beliefs of someone who's a Democrat, and vice versa. How well can a Democrat estimate the beliefs of a Republican? And then I expose you to a lot of content, and there's some kind of content where over time, if after like a month of seeing a bunch of content, your ability to estimate what someone else believes goes down. The gap goes bigger. You are not estimating what they actually believe accurately. And there's other kinds of content that maybe is better at synthesizing multiple perspectives, right? That's like really trying to say, okay, I think the thing that they're saying is this, I think the thing that they're saying is that. And content that does that minimizes perception gaps. So for example, what would today look like if we had changed the incentive of social media and YouTube from optimizing for engagement to optimizing to minimize perception gaps? And I'm not saying like that's the perfect answer. That would have fixed all of it. But you can imagine in, say, politics, whenever I recommend political videos, if it was optimizing just for minimizing perception gaps, what different world would we be living in today? And this is why we go back to Charlie Munger's quote. If you show me the incentive, I'll show you the outcome. If the incentive was engagement, you get this sort of broken society where no one knows what's true and everyone lives in a different universe of facts. That was all predicted by that incentive of personalizing what's good for their attention. And the point that we're trying to really make for the whole world is that we have to bend the incentives of AI and of social media to be aligned with what would actually be safe and secure and for the future that we actually want.
Now,
Wow. So that was really eye-opening to me when I learned about perception gaps. Now, it's important to understand that we're not saying, oh, truth doesn't matter. Let's just everybody just understand everyone else's point of view, some sort of relativism. I mean, we could think about this even in terms of dealing with evil. One of the things that often goes wrong in military strategy is that we think we understand the enemy, even though our attempts at understanding are superficial, and we do not really put our mind, we do not really get inside the mindset of the enemy, and then we make strategic blunders. And here is Hitler, and he had written his diatribe, Mein Kampf, as early as 1925. But instead of understanding his evil aims on his own terms, from inside his own system, so to speak, the British interpreted Hitler through the lens of their own perspective. And thus, Neville Chamberlain truly believed that Hitler was telling the truth when he promised not to expand beyond the annexation of the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. And this story is told in Malcolm Gladwell's book. So this was just a truly fascinating book for me. I enjoyed it so much. I listened to the audiobook and it was just so interesting. He gives example after example of how we misread strangers, how we misread people from other cultures when we don't take time to understand them from their own framework. And it gives a number of examples from war and espionage where perception gaps led to tactical blunders, because because people were overconfident that they understood other people when they really had not taken the time to develop a accurate and deep understanding. So I like this quote that is attributed to Aristotle. I don't know if Aristotle actually said this. I haven't checked his whole corpus, but um, this quote floats around the internet, and it kind of encapsulates this idea that I'm trying to convey, which is the mark of an educated mind is to be able to entertain a thought without accepting it. Um, Entertain a thought as in being able to understand and accurately understand um, positions even without agreeing with them. And of course, we all know what this looks like when it isn't in place. We have multiple examples from the circus that has become our public discourse. Now, we can think of this in terms of the epistemic virtue of cognitive empathy, just as um, emotional empathy is the ability to feel what someone else is feeling, even if it's different from your own emotions. Similarly, cognitive empathy is the ability to think the thoughts of somebody else and to understand them. Now, one of the questions people ask is in moral issues or things to do with when you're dealing with evil, do we really want to have cognitive empathy to or even to synthesize different perspectives, understand why people have different views, try to understand someone's position from their own, from the context of their own framework and so forth. Now, I would say yes, even when you're dealing with straightforward moral issues or evil, wickedness, you do want to still exercise the virtue of cognitive empathy and to have um, um, small perception gaps. Um, I'll give you some examples. We can understand when we try to have this type of cognitive empathy and understanding, attentive understanding, then we can see how psychedelics make sense given people's hunger for transcendence. And then understanding that will impact how we address the problem. For example, by stressing the need for beautiful worship and the true transcendence that Christianity can offer. So here's another example. We can understand that marriage to robots, getting married to robots, which is a new thing that is very trendy now in certain parts of the world. We can understand that that's not just people being stupid, but that makes sense once someone has accepted that human beings are just complex machines anyway. And then instead of just dismissing people as stupid and willfully ignorant, we can have a conversation about anthropology and metaphysics and the theology of the image of God. When we understand that contemporary man has been conditioned to view freedom non-teleologically, then it makes sense why a thoughtful person would think we can switch genders. And rather than just saying, oh, you're stupid, we can have a conversation about what it means to be actually free and how the modern notion of freedom, which leaves us infinitely malleable, is actually a form of bondage. But to have this type of cognitive empathy, we sometimes need to take a break from the superficiality of the world of podcasts, social media, and shallow news, and seek out thoughtful scholars and academics who really help us to be more reflective and to reach deeper levels of understanding. And we need to cultivate the epistemic virtues in ourselves and to have habits of working with information that rather than merely burrowing us deeper into the epistemic vices, enable the epistemic virtues to flourish in our life. Thank you for your attention, and God bless you.